Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview Podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and their destruction in Genesis 19. It's an unparalleled story, meaning there's no other ancient literature that deals with this destruction of these two cities. So we're in a biblical story and should, I was going to say have fun with it, but it's not a happy story at the same time. So welcome, Mike. And we're over 20 episodes now or so, and that to me is a milestone in the sense you're dealing with two unprofessionals here, right? We're doing this and learning as we go, and I hope it's getting better as we go. I don't know how to judge that in the sense of doing it better, but I remember when I started this whole concept of a podcast, or I was telling someone that I was going to do it, and they said, your first one, you always do your second podcast, never your first. And of course, that's a joke, meaning you can count on it being a challenge because there's a big learning curve to it. But we're up to 20 or so, or past 20. So congratulations, Mike. Thanks again for being part of this.
Yeah, congratulations, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this. It's been a wild ride, and thank you to the listeners for actually sticking with us, because like Ron said, we're not professionals. This is not something that he and I have been practicing doing. I've only done a couple of interviews before, but nothing this consistent. And so it has been fun. It has been a good journey doing this. And also, thanks to Mel and Rich for also being part of this journey with us. They're helping us out on the other side as well for interviews and the work that the foundation is doing. And so, yeah, we're glad everyone's been sticking with us and just learning along the way with us.
Mm-hmm. What I'd like to throw out as an opening idea to you, Mike, before we get into Genesis 19 is, and it's based on, I've heard this over the years, and it's a great question. It comes up in various conversations. What books should I read if I want to develop or get better at my Divine Counsel worldview? What books, what reference materials, what authors and such? My first response, and I always think of it, and I don't mean it to be rude, is everything. Everything, because in other words, as soon as you say, well, read this guy or read that, yes, okay, well, I would certainly say Dr. Heiser's works. He's coming at it from a Divine Counsel worldview. Everything he writes, I mean, especially later in his life, he was coming at, his understandings through that. I would read, again, one of my favorite authors today is N.T. Wright, but he doesn't have a Divine Counsel worldview. And so, but here's the thing, can you read him and understand how to apply what he's saying into a Divine Counsel worldview? Absolutely. He's a historian at heart, which means as he reads the Bible, he's asking, what did the original audience think in what was being said? Well, that's, again, rule number one of our, I think it was 6 things I threw out as a Divine Counsel worldview outline in one of our opening podcasts. So there are, there are many authors to read, if not, again, here I would say, never not read something. Don't ever say, well, this person doesn't have a Divine Counsel worldview. No, that's not the litmus test by which I pick up a book. For me, and here's where I'd open it up to you, Mike, I'd love to get your opinion. When you're looking at a pile of books, or you're at a used bookstore, or at a book table at ETS, what books do you decide to buy? Here's my opinion, and I'd like to get yours. Cost always comes into play, because I can't afford everything. In a perfect world, I would, right? But I can't afford it. So what I'll do instead of buying some books is I'll certainly look at it. I'll sometimes take pictures, screenshots of different portions. There was a great commentary on Galatians I saw, 480 pages, right? But I wanted to know his view on 3:11, I think it was. So I cheated and I just took screenshots of the 4 pages he had on a certain passage. That was my equivalent of buying the book. So I put the book down and walked away, but I had in one sense purchased what I needed out of that book. So yeah, cost always comes into play. Is it something that I think will increase here's my second question that I asked myself. Will this book, whether I agree with it or not, help my understanding of the broad picture of the Bible. That's often what I ask myself, because I'm a big picture person now. When you go through PhD work, as you're going to learn, Mike, you have to deal with the gravel on the ground, the text and verbs and stems and roots and all that. But then when you get into later stages, and for me, I'm twice your age, that you get to say, now's my time to blank. And for me, that blank is filled in with what's the big story of the Bible. And so I'll sometimes buy a book for no other reason than he's asking the big questions. And I like that, whether I agree or not. I just want to know his opinion. Again, do I have a rule then I go by beyond that? Specific interests, and that's always moving around. Why do you buy a book, Mike?
It's the kind of the rabbit hole that sometimes, I know I have fallen into it many times of, so like, for example, yesterday I'm writing an email to one of our instructors at the Awakening School of Theology, and he and I are talking about a possible course that he could do. And so I told him, hey, I'll send you over a list of resources and materials that I've heard of. I don't necessarily have all of them myself, but I have heard maybe even Mike, Dr. Heiser talking about it before, or some other scholars are in the field. And then I ended up finding myself drawn to 2 books that I did not have as providing that. I was like, I wonder what the price is right now for them. And then I looked it up, and I just gave in to the temptation of just like, I want to read, and I want to, you have said it, and I'm pretty sure Dr. Heiser has said it as well, to read widely and as much as you can get your hands on. Whatever, yes, costs is always going to be a factor. There is no doubt about that. But whatever you're able to, you don't have to always buy everything. You can always go to the local libraries. You can do searches. You can look at Google Books. There's all these ways to find resources. I just would encourage folks not to plagiarize or to download reference books that are not really actually free.
Can you do that?
It's a little bit of an ethical issue for me, but
okay. I suppose there's an ability to get around the system to where you can download things that you didn't buy. I suppose that's
and I would just say, like, I understand the drive, the hunger for it. I just think that if cost is a factor, then let that be part of the limitation. Like, limitation breeds creativity, but keep it within ethical grounds. But I think for me, like, ever since learning about the Divine Counsel material and getting to know Mike and his works, some of the criteria that I look at now these days are they asking very interesting questions? Are they looking at source material and ancient context? Right. I'm not necessarily interested in the 16th century framework of theology. I want to try to get closer to the time frame of what we can find of the biblical writers. I want to understand their world. I want to understand their setting, their audience, who the writers possibly were, what were they thinking, what were the things they were commonly into. Like, even with the same instructor I was talking with, he focuses a lot on Second Temple material, but his particular niche is Second Temple material that's in non-Hebrew material. Okay. So Greek, Aramaic, Latin, like those kind of subjects, because it's just an acceptance of the fact that in the Second Temple period, it wasn't just Hebrew writing. It was the fact that the world has now been opened up because of the Roman roads, literal Roman roads, and that you had all these different cultures and different people and different languages now interacting with Old Testament material. People who speak Aramaic, people who speak Greek, people who speak Latin, they were reading the same stories and they were having that material translated to their language, and they were interacting with it, and they came with their ideas and thoughts. And there is no way to get around the fact that Second Temple Judaism was influenced by Hellenization, by Greek thinking. It's just a matter of how Hellenized were they? How Grecian were they affected? right? The closer you get to national identity, then yes, the less possibly. But then there's also almost the xenophobicness that kicks into their writings at times towards Gentiles, right? So you have to factor all those kind of thoughts in. I'm interested in those kind of writings.
The question of does Athens and Alexandria get along, or Jerusalem and Athens, or I forget the two cities that are compared sometimes, but the argument will be, and it'll be debated, even up to Augustine, is how Grecian do we want our Christianity to be versus Old Testament or Hebrew, that kind of thing. So read and you're saying the same thing as me in that sense that today, I think the best answer to what books do I read, besides the ones that I'm being helped by the most, and that's again a decision of the person, but everything you can get your hands on. One other introductory thought I want to talk about quick before we get into Genesis 19, because it came up last time, is the question of, or shall I call it the challenge of, is a divine counsel worldview something developed by addition, or is something else going on? And what I mean by that is, I think it's easy it's easy to fall into the idea, the method of saying to myself, I have my understanding of the Bible already intact. I grew up as a Christian, I went to church, blah, blah, blah. Now I'm going to add in a divine counsel worldview, and I'm going to have the gods being real. I'm going to have the gods being authoritatively real. In fact, that they get involved in the affairs of mankind. And that's, again, very basic to the divine counsel worldview, is that the gods have to be real, they are real, and that they actually involve themselves in the stories of the Bible. Here's what I'm also, and I'll just say it as a challenge, and I don't mean to solve anything here, but as we continue our podcast together and things like that, what I'm noticing for me, and it happened last time in our last podcast, that I said in 18 something, I forget the verse, 18:19, that when Abraham is said by the Lord that he is to, quote, do righteousness and justice. And then I come, and we talked about this, that we come into a New Testament passage of Paul, and we start talking about imputed righteousness. Here's what I think we have to, again, be ready for. And this doesn't solve it. This simply is trying to, bring up a point that needs to be said. A divine counsel worldview is not created by addition. I just don't keep adding thoughts to an already established worldview. What you end up doing, in my opinion, and this has happened for me, I come upon something like 18:19, and I say to myself, this is part of the story of a divine counsel worldview, that this man Abraham, following Yahweh, among the possible gods to follow, he chooses Yahweh. He is then said to do righteousness. That means, and I'm putting this as a stake in the ground theologically, that a worshiper of Yahweh, which is the major question, can do righteousness as a daily part of his life. In other words, this concept of depravity or imputed righteousness doesn't even come into play at this point in the story, because we already have a story developing where a Yahweh follower is doing righteous deeds. So what that does for me is say, okay, if I come upon reading, and you kind of hinted at this when you say that reading someone today who is talking about 16th century questions doesn't interest you as much. I'm there too. In other words, when I pick up a book on you name it, and it gets into it, let's say imputed righteousness, and it starts talking in terms of what Paul said about righteousness, and they never even go back and question Genesis 18:19 as though it's a rudimentary part of the story. That makes me personally suspicious. And I say, well, they don't have a divine counsel worldview in this sense. They're not taking the story left to right, as though what's being said is important to what's being developed. So I personally, this is again frustrating some of my Reform friends, I don't have a view of imputed righteousness because of my divine counsel worldview. In other words, that worldview, by the time I get to Paul, is so developed and so, it's purring along and it's working just fine, that when I get to any concept of an imputed righteousness, I go, well, no, I I don't see it because my worldview doesn't have it in there as I've understood it, developing. So is that making sense? What I'm nervous that I hear some people doing among my friends is they're adding a divine counsel worldview to an established creedal or confessional model, and they're saying things that I'm sensing are contradictory to each other, as though they think it's part of the worldview, but they're really saying contradictory things because one worldview doesn't match another one.
I guess I would approach it for me, metaphors are a very big deal, right? The kind of metaphor that comes in mind is then usually, again, the little mini story that we would tell to describe what we're trying to talk about. The metaphor that comes in my mind as you're talking about, how does a DCW or how does a divine counsel worldview factor in to my theology? I would think of it as a renovation of a house. Okay. And it's not so much of a question of, do I keep adding in, as though it's just tacked on, or am I doing a renovation? Am I fixing things underlying down at the core of, for example, in the foundation? Here in the Boston area, in the Northeast, all of our homes, all of the houses have basements. And it was a big surprise to me the first time I ever went down to Oklahoma when my then girlfriend, who's now a wife, to find out that the homes had no basements there. Right. It was just all on slabs of concrete, which just boggled my mind, because in my head, it was like, well, then where did all the mechanical go? Where's your HVAC?
Well, where's your stuff?
Yeah, where's your plumbing? and so it was just kind of weird to me. And so when I think of the metaphor, I'm thinking of a metaphor of a basement, houses, floor, roof, attic, and everything like that. And to me, a DCW is simply, you could add it in, but it might be jury-rigged.
Okay, I like that.
And over time, as you're going along, you're realizing, this is not as optimal as possible. What do I have to really do? I could just add AC to the home by just sticking a bunch of units in the windows. Or I could go through the more harder, but maybe more time-consuming work of actually installing a real full-on heat pump system and getting all the ducting and all the venting and everything properly done, but which is more worth it in the long run, right? And I think in going back into just about theology and about spiritual terms and about spiritual formation, we as human beings, we over time will constantly be renovating and improving and trying to have a clearer and more precise way of understanding the world. And in many ways, a DCW at the very least introduces the factor that we are living in a world that is not just only physical, but also spiritual. Mm-hmm. And even that itself means I have to rethink and rewire how I view my reality. And so can it be done by addition? I think it can be. But I think over time, there is going to be the desire to want to renovate.
Yeah. I love your illustration. That works for me. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I think, at the heart of the Reformation was always this desire to reform, this desire to hey, we're getting back to the actual text. We were wrong here. We thought sacraments were a thing. We just didn't realize the word choices were so different versus Latin and Greek. That was one little tweak that happened just from going back to just a closer analog of the language that the writer spoke, right? And so imagine if we kept on doing that, that we would eventually over time, it's what, Luther and Calvin had great thoughts. Zwingli had some great thoughts, but they only knew what they only knew in the 16th century. Their language skills were only at a certain point. We only knew so much of Latin. We only knew so much of Greek and Hebrew. We only had so many documents. But as we constantly discover and learn, we're supposed to adjust and pivot and make reformation changes and renovation changes. Mm-hmm. It shouldn't just be a static house. A house from 100 years ago is great. It could be a museum piece, a historical society preservation project. But even people who live in historical houses here in Massachusetts, they want to add an AC. They want to add in heating. They don't want a coal fireplace.
A nice one there. Good point. Hey, I appreciate your off the cuff illustration that you didn't prepare for until I asked you, and yeah, it works really well. Thank you. We'll see this as we go through many other opportunities to swap out the window unit and put in AC along the way. All right, 19:1 begins with the introduction of a word that, again, we are suspecting, but we now have it said, the two angels. Almost every version, ESV, New King James, has angel there. But again, as we've recommended before, whenever you see the word angel in your Old Testament, you can pretty much predict, well, we know the word angel is an English word, so we have to go back and ask what is in the Hebrew, as we do here, and it's malachim. So two malachim came to Sodom. Now the two malachim, in fact. So now what we have are the two men of 18 that have talked or have rescued Lot, or I'm sorry, they're coming in to rescue Lot. Yeah, we've not gotten there yet, have we? There were two men that left Abraham, and now they're called malachim. So whether we want to know them as human or divine, the text, when it puts the word angel in there, is predicting that these will be divine beings. And based on verse 5 and then verse 10 and 13, for various reasons, they're going to be thought of as divine beings. So retroactively, we've gone back and put the word angel on top of the word malachim there. But we'll leave it for now. That's fine, but again, I'm uncomfortable with it. Verse 1, two men came to Sodom, or two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting at the gate of Sodom. The last we heard from Lot was in 14:16, when he was mentioned as being part of the story of when he was captured by the king of Sodom, or captured by I forget which king it was, and then he comes back with the spoils that Abraham saves. And so we learn that he becomes a resident of Sodom between chapter 14 and 19 by how he is described here, sitting in the gate of course, being in the gate of an ancient city meant you're part of the culture. You know, some gates were very large in that day, meaning this is where you did trading and covenant making and all sorts of things. So he may have been a upstanding member of the city. We don't know, but it implies he was part of this city. 2, and said, so he rose to meet them. Lot sees these two malachim, he thinks they're humans, and he says, my lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go your way. And he's just giving normal, what do you call it? Red Roof Inn. Hospitality, to two visitors as they're working their way through town. He says no, or they said no, we will spend the night in the town square. He pressed on them strongly, verse 3, so they turned aside to him and entered his house. We suspect it means, again, he is putting them under even guard of some kind. When you bring someone into your house, you're giving them sanctuary to some degree in their worldview. Yeah. He made them a feast, baked them unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people, to the last man, trying to say, this is a big group of people, surrounded the house, and they called to Lot. They must have known again who this man was. Where are the men? And again, the word for man there is just the normal Hebrew word for a male. Who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them. Now that's the literal line in Hebrew. The New King James adds in italics, know them carnally, which is again giving the innuendo that to know them, when it doesn't say what they're after, to know someone, this could be just be to interrogate them. We want to know what these two men are doing in your home. The problem is that to know someone in numerous Old Testament stories has a sexual innuendo attached to it. So the way the New King James adds the word in italics, carnally, which gives that sexual deviancy problem airtime, I think that's happening from what we can tell. But again, just to be fair to the story, we're not told a lot of what they're asking for, but we get the sense it's wicked. And as we listen to Lot's response, I think this gives more credence even to that. He is very nervous to let these men leave his home. Verse 6, Lot went out to the men at the entrance and shut the door after him, saying, I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Now, the question of verse 8 is often fairly wondered about because it's bizarre. Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. There's that, again, sense of sexual deviancy. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. Again, the idea of putting them under guard almost is how Lot is seeing this. Well, what is what is Lot saying? This is, again, not part of a divine counsel worldview. In my mind, this is simply doing your work exegetically and culturally. 2 options that I've heard of. One is that he's actually giving his daughters to these people to let them, as he says, do anything you want, but I'm not going to let these 2 men out. Another option, and this comes out of, just background study Bible kind of discussion, is that he meant it sarcastically. It would be like saying, you want my money? This is like if you're being robbed and you say, you want my wallet? Well, take my shirt too then. In other words, you're not, do you realize, and he's trying to, in other words, in this view, he's trying to prick the consciences of the men by saying, hey, listen, I've got 2 daughters and, you could do what you want with them, but you can't have these 2 guys. He's saying it sarcastically. He's not really wanting nor ever intending to give the men of the city his daughters. I like that second view because notice it does not say that he actually sent the 2 women out. So that's a better option to me because I'm having trouble with a man giving his 2 daughters to a madding, a raucous crowd. And it does truly get scary here what they're going to do. So any thoughts so far as I've wandered along?
So I'm looking at as well, like the notes from the Faith Life Study Bible, for example, and it mentions here in this line on verse 8, do to them as you please. Hospitality towards strangers was generally considered a moral imperative in the ancient Near East. This honor code meant that Lot could not turn the strangers over to the men of Sodom. In a patriarchal culture, daughters would have been viewed in lesser terms than Lot's male guests. And then you continue. However, Mesopotamian law codes parallel to the biblical laws make it clear that violating a betrothed woman, which Lot's daughters were, was a crime punishable by death. Mm-hmm. According to even ancient Near Eastern customs then, Lot understood just how evil offering his daughters to the men was, but he may have considered a lesser evil. And so essentially it's a rock and hard place because
fair enough.
Like it's because like the very way that the scripture, the writer is indicating, like they came under the shelter of his roof, that he has taken charge of protecting them. And from a Middle Eastern, like from an ancient Near Eastern culture and even modern Middle Eastern cultures today, there is that sense of if you have taken in a guest, that guest's life is now your responsibility. Mm-hmm. It's on you. And so if something happens to them, then something, like essentially made the same thing be done unto you, that kind of idea. And so he's in a terrible situation. And I think, oftentimes when people try to explain away the horror of the verse, they're trying to actually get rid of the horror.
Right.
But as the reader, as the story goes, you as the listener are supposed to experience, holy cow, Lot, what are you doing? Like you're supposed to have that visceral reaction. And, I would imagine, especially, folks who are parents like you, Ron, that you would be immediately thinking of like your own daughters, your own children, of like, no, this is terrible. Right. And that's the visceral reaction that's supposed to come out. That's actually what the writers are trying to do to us as we read this story. We're supposed to feel this. Again, going back to our last podcast episode, that's the point of story. Story is supposed to teach you something and also evoke emotion and get gut reactions, because we remember stories so much more vividly than an outline of point 1 and point 2 and sub point A. It's something very memorable, and we have an instant reaction to the text of how could he even contemplate something like this, right? And
yeah, which is why I like the sarcastic view that he's saying, take my daughters. Of course, I'm not going to give them to you, but can you, in other words, understand how wicked what you're asking for is?
Yeah,
it's even on the level of that. So, all right, thank you. 19:9. They said, stand back, and they said, this fellow came to sojourn, and he has become the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. So then they pressed hard against the man Lot, drew near to break the door down. Again, remember, he's outside his own door. But the men reached out their hands, verse 10, and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. This is becoming an absolute mob scene, truly scary story.
Yeah.
And they struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out groping for the door. There's the evidence that these are probably divine beings. We have a line in one of the Mesopotamian one of the Sumerian texts that talk about Baal being asked to blind someone. So the idea of a divine person blinding a human is not outside the. In fact, the Deuteronomy 28:28 has Yahweh promising to, quote, blind his own people if they don't follow him. So there is that precedence for a divine being blinding a human, and that seems to be why we can call these divine beings, at least. So now we've got a mess on our hands in verse 12. The men said to Lot, the angels, the divine beings, have you anyone else here? Sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone else you have in the city, bring them out of the place and remember, and we bring that back, that conversation of having 10 or so people left in the city, would God destroy the city? However that conversation should have ended, you still have, then what God's going to do through these men is get the righteous ones out. At least that's the invitation. So, in fact, let's keep going and we'll see that word even used. For we are about to destroy this place because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord. And the Lord here is, again, a key point to the story. The Lord has sent us to destroy it. So Yahweh is the one who has put out the order, but notice who's going to do the order, and that's one of his messengers. So this is just standard things to remember. Again, for me, it's a divine council worldview issue that, as we've said, the greater the king, this is the mind of the earliest reader, the greater the king, the greater the court. The greater the God, the larger his court. So the idea of the Lord God of hosts, which is a common phrase of the Old Testament, what that always brings to mind to the original reader is the idea that Yahweh is so great, and his greatness shows itself in the great number of those who follow or work for him. That is the gods, as we could use the term Elohim in the plural sense. So Yahweh has many Elohim at his behest, and two of them are standing here now with Lot just inside of his door, and they're claiming to, for Yahweh, do the work that Yahweh wants. Can I take the listener to Daniel 4? To me, this is one of the most helpful ways of seeing this agency idea work. In Daniel 4, verse 17, we are in the story of Nebuchadnezzar and the dream he's having. And who is talking? I think this is Nebuchadnezzar talking. He says this decree, and he's hearing a conversation in the heavens in his dream, and he says in 4:17, this decision is by the decree of the watchers, and the sentence by the word of the holy ones, the kedoshim, often a synonym for a god, a created deity, is a holy one. In order that, keep going, that the living may know that the Most High, presumptive God, rules in the kingdom of men, and he gives it to whomever he will and sets it over the lowest of men. So who's really in charge? The Most High. Who's making the decision to make Nebuchadnezzar turn into an animal? That's a decision made by the watchers. Then in 24, same chapter, Daniel 4:24, this is the interpretation, O king, Daniel now talking, this is the decree of the Most High. So now you turn, in Daniel's opinion, yes, it's the decree of the watchers, but then Daniel, shall we say, clarifies that by saying this is the decree of the Most High. It's the same thing. The decree of the Most High, the decree of the watchers, those are synonym ideas. And then you get to 35 of that chapter where Nebuchadnezzar is lifting his eyes and making sense of everything. Who knows if he really converts, but at least he says this. 35, all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He, Yahweh, or the Most High, does his will in the army of heaven. Now he's putting both of them together again. Who gets the final call? Yahweh, or the high God. How does he do it? He does it through the Tsavaot, the army of heaven. And among the inhabitants of the earth, no one can restrain his hand or say to him, what have you done? So I just love in Daniel 4 the interplay between the decree of the watcher. Notice they're never called angels. That's why I don't like the word angel, because it gives the sense of, well, it's just an angel. No, it isn't. It's a deity. It's an actual created divine being who works for Yahweh. And that's why I would never expect the word angel there. And I don't get it, because again, they don't have an angel in their cosmology. They have messenger deities, yes, but they don't have angels. So my point is, Daniel 4 has a beautiful story that equates the wisdom and the power and the authority of the Most High, but you slide in so effortlessly the concept of these other beings that do his will for him. Because he's the great king, he's got such a great court that often will do those kinds of things for him. So that agency idea among the created deities is beautifully done in Daniel 4. And I bring that back into 19 of Genesis. And you have these two Malachim who are in the house of Lot speaking for Yahweh and what they're going to do to the city because Yahweh wants it destroyed, and yet they claim they're going to do it. So all that to say, we don't have to get into any Trinitarian issues to me. You can just say, this is what it means to be a host of Yahweh. I get to do his will because I am sent by him. And in doing so, I'll even say to the humans I run across, this is my decision, or even this is my job to do. So anything you want to add there before we keep moving along, Mike?
I think, one, as you were speaking, I was actually really intrigued by the description of these messengers saying, because the outcry against its people. And as I was looking up the Hebrew word for it, it's very interesting that the etymology, the usage in the past, it's not just simply a shout, but it's a cry of distress, like a scream for help. And it's very interesting to me is that who's doing the outcry?
Yeah, I've wondered that. I should have maybe stopped and talked about it. But yeah, what do you think? Before having the renovation of a divine council worldview, I would have assumed that the outcry was from other peoples, other human beings, other nations, other towns, maybe people who have been oppressed by Sodom and Gomorrah. It may be that, but now I can understand a larger picture of that. Maybe the outcry may have been also from this council, that these messengers are conveying the message of essentially members of this divine council who are outcrying of the injustices that they are seeing being done within the city of Sodom and the city of Gomorrah. That it's so offensive to the point that this council is basically petitioning, and then Yahweh agreed. It's like, all right, let's do it. You're bringing up a good point about a divine council worldview, is that and I sense this is where our friends, and I've heard of this, where you're in a church, you're in a Sunday school class, and you say, what about this idea? And people look at you funny and say, where'd you get that from? And you say, well, okay, it's a divine council thing. People, and I understand the nervousness that people have toward those odd views that come up in a Sunday school class. But here is where, and this is the front end of our conversation today. When you're developing a divine council worldview, there are certain stakes you're going to put in the ground. One of the earliest ones is that because these beings are real, A, and B, they have authority, that they're going to show up in the story. And that when they do, or they could show up, at least you got to ask the question. And we're going to do this, by the way, in chapter 20 and 21. I'm going to ask the possibility of something that, again, I've never heard of before. It's in no commentary, because no commentator that I'm reading is asking it from a divine counsel worldview standpoint. So at least, yeah, I appreciate you bringing up the outcry, because could it be that this is an outcry that is hinting that we have divine beings around the throne of Yahweh crying out for the people of Sodom who are being mistreated? Something like that could very well be what's going on there. So,
and I think also, right, this comes back again, and I think it wasn't like in our podcast you and I were participating in, and we were chatting about this, and I brought up this concept of we as Americans, especially in a Western, U.S. setting, we have very little exposure to monarchies. We have little exposure to the idea of a king and a court. But for me, I grew up with my parents, and they would watch like these Chinese, melodramas and, historical dramas that go back to like the ancient Chinese emperors. But more recently, for myself personally, I've been watching a lot of Korean, like historical dramas, and I have to hand it to the Korean, these Korean historical dramas, because unlike the Chinese ones, typically that I've seen, just probably because of budget and space, the king, the emperor, and his court is really small, and even the courtroom is really small, and there'll be barely anyone inside the courtroom whenever he's talking.
That's a budget issue, I think.
Yeah, but in the Korean ones, there is at least 50 to 100 different extras. So they're all saying something. They're all making noise. They're all having a loud argument and conversation. You have soldiers on the side. They're also participating in some way of making sure, like, okay, you guys are getting too rowdy. Like, there is this sense of life and vitality that's going on that in a courtroom, it is not quiet. And that the emperor, he speaks, but his courtiers are able to challenge him of like, hey, I don't agree with you. This is why. And they will have a back and forth with the emperor, with each other. And that, to me, when I like, because of that, I'm having that kind of imagery of the idea of if a divine counsel is out there, boy, that's interesting, of like just how lively these conversations must have been. And if this is an outcry that is maybe connected to divine beings, wow, whatever happened within Sodom and Gomorrah definitely got their attention to a point that, all right, a decision had to be made.
That's a great call. And we're going through this in Sunday school tomorrow in church. 18, we might even get into 19. And that's a fair question to ask the people around the room. And that outcry idea, I bet you some of them will come up with what you came up with there, just because they're having a worldview now that allows for it. So, all right, thank you. 14. So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, up, get out of this place, for Yahweh is about to destroy the city. But he seemed to his sons-in-law as jesting. We're not sure why. Maybe they were not believing him on other things. We're just not told a lot behind the story. As morning dawned, the messengers urged Lot, saying, up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city. But he lingered, so the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, Yahweh being, here's the first use of chesed in the Bible, merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. Chesed is a wonderful, beautiful word. It just means, no, I shouldn't say just. It means and includes in English loving kindness, patience, loyalty, love. It's just one of those words you can't translate in one word. We have chosen mercy as a common use of chesed, but we wish we had better ones to use. Actually, I take it back when I hover over it. It's going to be in 1919. Having shown me great mercy. That's where it actually shows up. What word do we have in 16? I'm not even sure. But the word merciful or chesed is actually in 1919. In fact, let's read there. Let's keep reading and get there. And as they brought them out, one said, "Escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley." The idea of looking back, I think, is euphemistic for pausing and even settling in, staying behind. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away. Lot said to them, "Oh no, my lords, behold, your servant has found favor," chen, a word we often translate as grace. "Your servant has found grace in your sight, and you have shown me great chesed in saving my life. But I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, this city," we're going to find out that's Zoar, "is near enough to flee to, and so it's a little city. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved." So he's just having a conversation again as part of the story. And he said to him, "I grant you all this favor also, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken." So Zoar, in fact, I won't read it, but verse 22 mentions it by name. It is the city of Zoar that he goes to, he flees to, which, by the way, that article that I mentioned last time in BAR talks about a little Christian a Christian location that has been saved over the years or memorialized in the city of Zoar. And even a synagogue was put up there by Jews along the way, and then even a Christian church and such over the years. So this city has at least had some traditional appreciation in how this works out. The sun had risen on the earth, verse 23, when Lot came to Zoar, and, here we go, 24, the Lord Yahweh rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from Yahweh out of heaven. By the way, let me read. Let me read. This is from the Cultural Study Bible, Cultural Background Study Bible, page 52. Rained fire and brimstone. Those words fall so easily off our lips that we often overlook what probably it looked like. Here's what they have as a note. The scene is one of divine retribution, and brimstone appears here and elsewhere as an agent of purification and divine wrath on the wicked. And he quotes Psalm 1 or Psalm 11, Ezekiel 38. So there is a bit of a allegorical use of this idea of brimstone often in the Bible. One can only speculate about the actual manner of this destruction, but perhaps the combustion of natural tars and sulfur deposits and the release of noxious gases during an earthquake form part of the story. The mineral salts of the region include sodium, potash, magnesium, calcium chlorides, and bromide. Again, when you're down in the Dead Sea area, called the Salt Sea in the Old Testament 9 times, it's never called the Dead Sea. That's a modern term. Mm-hmm. The Salt Sea has a lot of minerals that are very unique to itself. And then they continue with one more line. An earthquake in the area could easily have ignited these chemicals, causing them to rain down on the victims of the destruction. That's, again, why I like Cultural Study Bibles, is that what did it look like in the video to watch this kind of thing fall in? It might have been caused by a normal, although well-timed by God's design, earthquake. And this is the largest fault line in the world, running some 7,000 miles right on through this area. And that this fault line gave way, and we have now the visual picture of fire and brimstone being rained down upon the city, when really it's, again, by natural cause, you would say this is Yahweh using natural forces, as he loves to do, to accomplish his goal. So, let me, one thing, and this came up, I remember, in one of the conversations between me and Mike. I think he even had it in a book somewhere. You have this strange word or strange line where it says in 24, Yahweh rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from Yahweh out of heaven. There may be this idea of a two Yahweh view. This just is a conversation between friends, but to me, this is just a Hebrew way of talking. In 1 Kings 10, you have this line about Solomon, 1 Kings 10:13. And King Solomon gave the queen of Sheba all she desired, whatever she asked, besides what Solomon had given her. Well, you just said that. No, it wasn't. In other words, you can sometimes repeat the name of the person in the story. One other one, it's even more clear to me, is still Solomon. 1 Kings 8:1. And as I read this is almost literal word for word in Hebrew as well. Now Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the chief fathers of the children of Israel, to King Solomon in Jerusalem, that they might bring up the ark. So again, Solomon assembled the elders to King Solomon. How many Solomons are in the story? Only one. But the way Hebrew works is sometimes you can say Ron went and got the cup of coffee and brought it to Ron. That it's just how Hebrew works. So to me, the 1924 Genesis story doesn't mean there's two Yahwehs. It just means this is how Yahweh, or this is who sent it and how it got sent. So something like that. Otherwise, the Pillar of Salt, 1925, verse 26, actually. Lot's wife behind him looked back, implying, I think, that she stayed. And she became a pillar of salt. And even Josephus, in Hebrew tradition, Jewish tradition, 2nd century or 1st century AD, he even speaks of this as being something you can see to this day. So even in Jewish tradition, and you can go there today and see a lot of these salt formations, that becomes a story for the child to remember. Anything you want to add in before we finish up this one?
I think, just I love the fact that you brought up the cultural Bible and just the material from there, because I think as we read these stories, sometimes we go by and not linger on sort of trying to imagine what the destruction must have looked like, or how the destruction could have possibly looked like, depending on your view of the story. But I mean, there's just this horror of like everything, and knowing this as well about Lot, right? Because this is all within greater narrative that Lot decided Sodom and Gomorrah, this region, was pretty much almost like a garden paradise. And this garden paradise, this place that he decided, I'm going to put my tent peg in, and I'm going to settle in this area. And even sort of implied at the beginning of chapter 19 of how he was at the city gates, that like he has established a life here and thought that this would be a great place where he'll be prosperous. And now it's just wiped off the map. Yeah. And
never to be redone. I mean, there is no city of Sodom in history after this.
Yeah. And it's just the horror, not just from the supernatural level of what's going on in the story, but everything he had built, this whole life that he had built, even his wife is gone. And I think, that's what will eventually get picked up on as we go further on in the chapter, that everything that he thought was going to be rock solid was now just wiped away with fire and brimstone. Yeah. And it's tragic. It is absolutely tragic, and there's no way to not feel that for him, of just the horror of it.
And it's so tragic that the next story makes sense. As you bring that up, this is how I think those two daughters are going to feel, that they're the last people left on the earth, because they're going to go up into a cave. Well, we're going to get to it in just a moment. But is it possible that because of this scene that they just went through, that they really thought? In fact, I think they're even going to say it. No man on the earth to come. So, in other words, they thought they were actually alone with their father, and everyone on the earth had just died. That's kind of their version of it. But anyway, thank you. Let me finish up with 29, verse 29. It came to pass, is the New King James, so it was that, ESV. In Hebrew, it's just thus or so. I take 29 to be a summary of the entire story. And let me throw an idea at you, Mike, here, because, again, on the fly, but based on a divine counsel worldview, what we, and try saying this in Sunday school, not having heads look at you funny, but so it was that when, no article, Elohim, destroyed the cities of the valley. Now, again, we've had the Lord, the Lord, the Lord, the Lord the whole time. the last time we had the word Elohim even appear in the text of Genesis is chapter 17, verse 23. In other words, we've gone 2 chapters without saying the word Elohim at all. But we know in a Divine Council worldview that you are always asking this question in the back of your mind. Which Elohim does what, right? You have a Most High that does things, and you have other created ones that do other things. So let me read it a certain way that possibly it works lexically. Now, whether it's what he's saying, I'm open to just letting it go. I'm not going to stand on this one, but I'm just going to say, here's how it could sound to the reader who's getting a summary of a fascinatingly curious story where God sends 2 Malachim to do what he could have done on his own. But he doesn't. He sends 2 Malachim. So how would that go in summary? Here's how I'd read it that way. So it was that when Elohim created, there's no article there, when Elohim destroyed the cities of the valley, Elohim remembered Abraham, again, just this created divine being, small g God. The God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he, that Elohim, overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. In other words, if you had put Yahweh in there, it would work fine. But you could also just stick in Elohim because we've had 2 Elohim in the story doing what they just did. So I'm just saying that this is the kind of thing that because of the worldview, we get to at least wonder why for the first time in this story, and since like 2 chapters ago, we finally get the word Elohim even in the story. It could be talking about a created divine being who was sent to do everything he had just done. So I just throw that out there. One of the thing that we have to take into account, because 2 Peter does it. I'm going to turn to 2 Peter chapter 2, where Peter is reviewing the story of numerous parts of the Genesis narrative, including the angels who sinned, probably Genesis 6, the story of Noah. This is the 2 Peter 2:5, did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, turning the cities, verse 6, of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes. So there we go. So 2 Peter 2:6 is talking about our story in Genesis 19. But notice what he says 4 times that catches our attention. Verse 7, he delivered righteous Dikaios Lot, who was oppressed with the filthy conduct of the wicked. For that Dikaios man, righteous man, dwelling among them, tormented his Dikaios soul from day to day. I mean, he's carefully trying to remember that, or tell the reader, you had within Sodom a righteous man who was spared. And then even verse 9, the application of that becomes this. Then, therefore, the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations and to reserve the unjust under punishment for the day of judgment. So the picture of 2 Peter, his midrash on the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, is that Lot was, and when he uses righteous, again, I'm not talking behavior, I'm talking in our worldview, he followed Yahweh. So my guess is I'm going to go back. I have the right, based on Peter, to go back and read this story, I think the way it was meant to be read as well, that here is a man that is righteous. He was following Yahweh. His morality is certainly to be in question based on, shall we say, where he lived. We don't know, but at least his following of Yahweh is consistent throughout the biblical story, that because of his Yahwism, shall we say, not his morality, he is one chosen to be saved, and that's even Peter's point. Remember, thus the Lord knows how to save the godly. And can we put the word godly on Lot? Well, the text does, because again, I think the story is which God do you worship, and that answer comes as Yahweh for at least the man Lot. So, anything you want to add there?
I was curious as to, as you're talking about and bringing up the question, because I had a feeling you were going to bring up the word Elohim.
You had a feeling. Good. Well, then,
yeah, and I was trying to figure out.
Yeah,
I was trying to figure out about the verbs in Hebrew that are connected.
They are singular. Yeah, I looked.
They are singular, and I find it interesting and strange a little bit.
Well, actually, yeah, destroyed is just an infinitive. We don't have a number on that one.
It is it's an appeal infinitive construct, and then there's another as well.
Remembered is Vav consecutive, third masculine singular. So Elohim remembered Abraham. So one Elohim did that.
Yep.
But so anyway, go ahead.
I was just really curious about, and then the word overthrew. When he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived, that is also an infinitive, but this time it's a cal. It's a cal infinitive construct. So you have two verbs that are infinitive constructs, different stems, peel and cal. And, generally in Hebrew, these infinitives are like verbal nouns that are describing, and it's only the context that will help us understand how they should be, related, subject, object kind of thing. I just find it weird that there's that particular choice of why not just simply say it as is using a cal,
right?
Just state it plainly, and using instead infinitives, verbal nouns to describe the destruction of the cities, the overthrow of the cities. I don't have an answer. I just find that a very curiosity, and this is a little part of for me is the spiraling of digging down, especially when you get into the grammar, you're trying to understand what is the author trying to do with these very specific word choices that the author decided to use. Could have just been used in a very cal-like way, like God destroyed the cities, God singular, third person masculine, and overthrew the cities could have also been cal, third person masculine. Mm-hmm. Anyways, I don't think there's an answer that at least I know of right now, but it's a curiosity to me.
Yep, and I'd recommend to the listener to not take this into Sunday school and bring it up. Yeah. I would feel for you if you did, and people would say, "What are you talking about?" Because until you get into it and feel comfortable discapitalizing the G every time on God, which I do in my mind, I always ask, which one? And we're going to talk about that in 20. To me, I'm going to have another way of looking at 21, actually, next time. 2021, where the God that runs Ishmael's life, I'd recommend, I think from what we can tell in the text, is not Yahweh. And I think the text will bear that out. We are getting close to, let's just close it out. 30 to 38, I don't need to read. These two women honestly think they're left alone. Verse 31, our father is old, and there is not a man on the earth to come into us after the manner of all the earth. In other words, if we don't have babies, the earth is done. That's how they were thinking in a cave. So what they do is reprehensible. We're not trying to minimize that, but they have children through their husband, their dad. And 30, the important thing to the reader is that by the time you get down to 37, the firstborn bore a son, called his name Moab, which in Hebrew has the sense of from father, from of father, from my father. So she names him literally from my father. He's the head of the Moabites to this day, as the reader hears, meaning that's where they come from. The famous enemies of the Israelites, the Moabites, they come from Lot's daughters. The younger bore a son, called his name Ben-Ami, son of my people, is literally how that would go. He is the father of the Ammonites. And again, those are bad words to an Israelite, Moab and Ammon. So enemies for most of Israel's history. There are some good stories that come from Moab, and Ruth is one of them, but most, again, Moabites are non-Yahwists. So I am done with 19. Anything more to add? Our time's up. Otherwise, I'm ready to jump into 20 and 21 next time with this story in mind. But anything you want to add as we close?
No, I mean, I think it's just continuation of just the tragedy of Lot and of his life. But it is interesting that they didn't stay at Zoar. If they had stayed in that small town, like maybe things would have been a little different, because then they wouldn't have been as convinced of like there's no one around, because they're still at least in a small town with some people still around them. Here they isolated themselves to a point where, yes, the daughters just generally thought like we've just gone through the apocalypse and everything is wiped out. How are we going to continue humanity? And this is just a terrible plan. But yeah, it's just interesting how just that little decision of not staying as Zoar then eventually led to the creation or the origin stories of two neighbors of Israel.
The kind of questions we would have had listening to the story.
And essentially these two frenemies of Israel over the ages. Sometimes good, a lot of times bad, not friendly at all. But not exactly enemies either.
But never told to be destroyed. When God lists the enemies to be wiped out in Deuteronomy 7, he does not mention Moabites or Ammonites. So at least there's some what's the viability to these people groups, even though they're enemies. So, all right. Well, thank you so much, and everyone for listening. We will see you next time.